Welcome to the Fight for Justice podcast. I'm your host, Uncle Fox Matone, and today I'm here with Raven Payment from Colorado. How you doing, Raven?
Doing great. Thanks for having me.
Oh, you're welcome. You are a member of the MMIR, so the Missing, Murdered, Indigenous Relatives Task Force of Colorado. Am I right?
You are correct.
Okay.
Say that 3 times fast.
And when was that established?
Our organization formally was established a little over a year ago as a 501c3 nonprofit. A little less formally before we got nonprofit status. We've probably been organized for 3 years total.
And how many's on the task force?
We currently have 5 sisters right now across the state.
So they're all female?
All female, correct.
And who was came up with the idea of the task force?
So rewinding a couple of years, we've had some co-founders who, they've moved out of state or whatever, so they're not necessarily part of the task force. But one of the co-founders is a Two-Spirit Comanche gentleman that now lives in Oklahoma, Richard Henson. Him and our current member and co-founder, Monica Snowbird, had been talking about this crisis and how do we respond to this crisis. And there was kind of a conversation of, well, what if we got together and started trying to track things or trying to help families, that sort of thing. So that's kind of where the idea was born.
Okay.
Several of us were kind of doing the work in our own time without a formal organization, like actually identifying murdered Indigenous people that were misclassified in, law enforcement databases, that sort of thing. So we all eventually just kind of organically came together.
Yeah, and I like the R at the end because it began with women, but again, there's also more than just women, and so in the ratio of how many men and women are missing in our community or in Native community. Who's higher?
So in Colorado specifically, men are murdered, Native men, are murdered at higher rates than women. I think the last time we took the poll, it was 56% men.
Okay.
Native men had been murdered in Colorado. Disproportionately, again, subject to more violence, more dire statistics. One of the other things that we like to point out, the word relatives, was kind of born from acknowledging the gender binary. Yeah. And not everyone identifies as man or woman. It can depend very much on tribal norms and, culture. But also recognizing that our Two-Spirit relatives are subject to even more dire statistics when it comes to violence, murder, and going missing. So relatives was kind of a more a nod to Native culture when we're talking about our people,
right.
While also trying to encompass everyone without an acronym that was 2 minutes long to say. Yeah,
because I seen people, but again, relatives sounds more culturally for our people, relatives, because of how we relate to Mother Earth, we relate to the bear, eagle. So saying relative seems like everyone to me. Yeah,
correct.
So that sounds really good to me. And when you guys started the task force, I noticed, and that's how I noticed on the task force on social media, was you guys passing bills at the state.
Yeah, members of our task force, and then also wider community members, because I feel like every Native person has been affected by this crisis one way or the other, came together in the 2022 legislative session in Colorado to establish the Office of Missing and Murdered Relatives. We call it OMMIR.
OMMIR. Okay.
Yeah, that's another acronym. That's kind of a mouthful to pronounce. But we came together and we passed this legislation, and it established an office within the Department of Public Safety that is solely focused on MMIR. Within that bill, it also established roles within the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, CBI, within their task force to have an analyst. Currently, it also established the Missing Indigenous Person Alert. We were the second one in the country, the second state in the country to establish this alert. And then it received significant pushback from we call it the alphabet agencies, the CBIs, the DCJs, yes, the CDPS, but also notably, we received significant pushback from Governor Polis, who is considered a Democrat, progressive. He is a gay man. But I will also point out he is still a rich white man.
Yes.
And they did not like the concept of MMIR or even having... There was a lot of misunderstandings with who we are as Native people, that they assume it's only about race or ethnicity, without understanding the unique political relationship that we have with the United States government as sovereign nations and people. So a lot of the attitude was like, well, why do you people get special treatment?
Yeah, you people.
You people. It's always like the you people under there.
Right.
One of the representatives for CDPS, when we were having some pretty tense conversations about the missing Indigenous person alert, his response verbatim was, we don't want to water down the effectiveness of our resources with another alert. Because they have like the silver alert for elderly people, Medina alert for endangered. There's some other ones out there. And, you know, I asked him to say the quiet part out loud, like effective for whom? Because we're showing you it's not effective for us. We got a lot of pushback saying it wasn't necessary. Since the time that the MIPA was instituted a little over a year and a half ago, one Native person a week goes missing in the state of Colorado. I think the last time I checked, we were at 77 alerts that had been issued. There was one actually issued this weekend while I was here in Phoenix. Fortunately, that relative was located safely within a 24-hour period. But it's interesting to see these agencies say that like, oh, we understand the Native community and this isn't needed. And the statistics were actually more dire than we were anticipating once some of these systems got put into place. Wow.
And where do we get the alerts at? I mean, if I say I live out here in Arizona, could we get alerts from here?
You could. It doesn't. So a lot of people confuse it with the Amber Alert.
Yeah.
So when an Amber Alert goes out and it's specifically for a child that has been abducted, you get an alert that goes to your cell phone. Like it makes that really crazy noise and everybody in the room gets it. The MIPA and the other alerts in Colorado do not function quite like that. So what it actually is it's an email blast from a software called AlertSense. And there's a really long email that goes to CBI. If people are interested in signing up for it, I can give you that piece of information. But essentially, you get an email as a citizen, and they have a flyer, like it's a standard template for MIPAs. But then the really good thing about it, one of the things we've said is that when we go missing in life, we later go missing in the data. And we are non-existent in the media when we do have a missing person. So what this MIPA does is it actually blasts the flyers to the media across the state. And also some partners, because borders are invisible in other states, and then also to other law enforcement agencies across the country. And we've actually seen a really positive response from the media where they will put that flyer up immediately when they get that on their web pages. And then it actually also helps some of the journalists to be like, oh, we should cover this story, and they'll want to reach out and talk to families and give some more coverage on these missing persons as they come out.
Okay. So I could put the information on a podcast episode and we could have everybody sign up for those emails.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, I get that. When I talk to the community of the Native community, it seems like a lot have the impression of, oh, they just ran away. Then they'll be, we don't want to rush it because they probably just ran away. And I feel like that's the wrong way to think when someone goes missing. There's some that do run away, but I want to know if they're just a runaway. I'd rather know that they're just a runaway than say, oh, they'll be back, and they don't come back. And so do you get a lot of that when people go missing? I mean, how long does it take? I think it should be right away. But I feel like the Native community, especially on a reservation, they will always think they are left with somebody or they just ran away and they'll be back.
So the term runaway to me, especially when we're talking in context of minors, is a minimizing term to me, because it gives that attitude of, one, they're acting of their own cognizance and they're totally safe and protected to be out in the wider world on their own. But similarly, when that term is used with law enforcement, it gives them an attitude of reacting less and without a priority. I will say we've had several families where when they come forward to law enforcement, when they're reporting their minor that has run away or is missing, law enforcement will be the first one to use the term runaway. And I find it infuriating when law enforcement agencies minimize and demean a situation by telling a family, oh, they'll just come back, even though these families are adamant that this is out of character for this child, that they wouldn't just run away, so to speak, or without even evaluating other risk factors. We've had situations with juveniles who are being groomed by an older man, for example, and they're taking advantage of this young person. Or if a young person, even if they do leave the home of, so-and-so, their own consent or whatever, there are so many other risk factors at play once they're no longer within the protection of their families or other adults, whether it's trafficking, being introduced to substance abuse, sexual assault, violence, other poverty circumstances that they find themselves in once they have quote unquote run away. Missing children, in my opinion, should have a higher priority for finding them. And what we've seen with law enforcement, it's generally not the case. Even outside of, missing juvenile, I forgot where I was going to go. So you can just edit that out. Yeah. I had a point. I don't know where the fuck I was going with it. That's okay.
But you're right. I mean, the runaway is not really... Okay, yeah, the runaway. But why did they run away?
That's where I was going with that,
And what's going to happen when they come back? I'm a bad kid. I'm just going to take off and, make everybody worry. It's not always like that. It's not always the reason why someone from the reservation runs away.
And similar, I mean, on the Front Range in Colorado, which is like Denver, Colorado Springs, down through Pueblo up into Fort Collins, we kind of call it the Front Range. We've had circumstances where the same juvenile has run away, quote unquote, more than once, and the MIPA has been activated more than once for their disappearances. And so one of our intentions when we started doing this work, both as a task force and with the legislature, was that, one, we're very much reactionary right now and responding to a crisis in real time. But the intent was that we're no longer responding and we're doing things that are proactive. So when people go missing, the idea is that we're reacting now to prevent them from becoming a homicide later on. They don't become a murder case. So when you find a missing person or a missing youth, you are able to hopefully point them to resources that eliminate the risk factors that may make them become a murder case or a homicide case later on, or subjected to more violence. So when we see youth that are running away multiple times, specifically when they're in the foster care system, there's a lot of questions that go on, like, well, what are they leaving from? Is it abusive? Does this family or this foster care system, do they have culturally relevant training? Is this child being supported culturally? Because oftentimes foster care families are not native.
Right.
Similarly, if they're running away from their biological parents, is there abuse happening in the home? What's going on from there, so that other resources are able to be put into place to hopefully prevent this child from more dire circumstances as they continue to leave.
When you do MMIR, is it teenagers, a lot of teenagers, or more adults? Do you know what would be the percentage on that?
I'd have to look at the percentage. I know we've broken it down. Anecdotally, off the top of my head, I'd probably say we're 50-50. Okay. And this has been another issue that we've had to confront with law enforcement. A lot of the adults who go missing are unhoused. And law enforcement will take the attitude that you can't be missing if you're unhoused, and they'll refuse to take a missing persons report, or they'll refuse to issue the MIPA, which leads to a host of other problems. We're slowly confronting that narrative, and also helping people find their relatives so that they can either bring them back home, because a lot of times the tribal communities are outside of Colorado where people come from, because it's such an intertribal hub.
Yeah.
So they can find their relatives who have been unhoused and don't have access to resources, and then try to help get them back home, and essentially address, some of the issues that may have led to them being unhoused in the first place.
Well, I know a lot let's say if you had relatives and they were drunk on a res, they get chased away. So like they would come out here in the valley and be homeless, and then from there go missing. So I know it definitely, it starts from home. On some of those issues, it starts from home, and it's something that we have to fix and somehow to make sure that these people our relatives are not missing. But how many of it is violent, like for like missing and murdered Indigenous, like because we have murder in there? I know personally, I haven't dealt with anyone close to a murdered. I know one of my relatives in California, my cousin's son had passed away in a car, and they said he overdosed, but they never checked on him, because people say that he didn't overdose. And so, but again, the city of Lakeport didn't do any kind of investigation. They just said, he OD'd on fentanyl, and that's the end of the case. So do you get a lot of those up there in Denver or in that area?
You're reminding me of a recent venture that we've started to undertake. So homicide is, it happens more often than I would care to, admit is the wrong word. But essentially, one of the things that we've noticed is there have been families that have come forward with their loved one, be it current or an older homicide, and they'll say, I know my relative was murdered. In one case, the circumstances was that there was evidence of strangulation in this particular individual. When we talked to CBI, they pulled the death certificate and worked with the investigative agency, and the coroner had reported that this person died of cirrhosis. And there's barely a mention of trauma to the esophagus. And so what we're finding is that in Colorado, up until this past year in the legislative session, there have been no standards or requirements for someone to be a coroner. I could have been a coroner up until this last year, as long as like my community voted me in, because it's an electoral process. So you've had a lot of coroners who either had no or limited medical training, questionable ethics, because there was also there's no accountability for coroners.
I didn't know that.
And so when you take a place like Denver, which is a huge metro area, and they're churning out bodies as quickly as possible, if they report something as a homicide, it's more work for them. They're probably going to have to go to trial. It's more paperwork. It'll continue to be something on their desk that they will have to deal with. When you combine that with racist attitudes and stereotypes, like this person might have had cirrhosis for a variety of reasons, but that doesn't mean that was what caused their death. So we tend to, most of the time, we trust families and what they say and what happened to their relatives. So again, like these coroners have had there's no incentive for them to do the right thing. And then B, they likely feel justified in their behavior just because, this person was, an addict.
Yeah.
And they were ruining their body, so I don't care to do anymore. But now that we've gone this far and we're starting to recognize like this problem with coroners and how deaths have been reported, I am certain that there are going to be cases that we don't even know of, unless families feel compelled to come forward and share those stories. And then conversely, I don't necessarily know that there's anything that can be done to these coroners that, cause this type of harm, for example, outside of lawsuits, which take energy and money and all that good stuff.
I think that a lot of our own people, they know how some people or some of these people passed away but keep quiet. And I feel like either they're covering for somebody or they're just covering for the family name. And so I know we have like in California and here in Arizona, that happens a lot. The family name, the family heritage. You don't want to say who did this and who did that, but we did have someone that came up and said, hey, it was one of my family members that gave this person fentanyl and they OD'd and they finally got him in jail. But I mean, I feel like there's some answers out there, just people got to come out and say it.
Yeah, there's another podcast series called Someone Knows Something.
Yeah.
And that's a motto that we've used a lot, especially with trying to solicit leads in cold case homicides, that someone knows something. There's a lot of stigma that I think has followed our communities, regardless of where you're from or what tribal affiliation you have, where, we've been fighting all these issues. We've been fighting addiction, just, fighting to survive, basically. And there's, stigmas where families may not want to talk about those things, or they don't want to be seen as violent. So it's a delicate line as task force members where we are not accountable to law enforcement or the American criminal justice system. We are accountable to our communities. We are accountable to families, and we are accountable to our stolen relatives. And much of that is following, a family's lead in how they want to see justice, being advocated for their loved one, or how they want their loved one's story told. We would never force families with cold case homicides. If they don't want to take things, through the criminal justice system, then that is not something that we would pursue, because justice looks different for everybody. Similarly, we track things differently than these government agencies. So one of the things that has been a criticism of mine, CBI does not count law enforcement homicides against Native people. Nationally, Native people are killed more by law enforcement than any other demographic. In Colorado, we have also seen a startling statistic of law enforcement violence against Native people. And so for those who aren't super familiar with Colorado, the two reservations in Colorado, which is Southern Ute and Ute Mountain, are really far away from the Front Range. It's, from Denver, I think Southern Ute is the closest, and it's like a 7-hour drive. So what we're seeing, though, is this violence from law enforcement that are not on reservation communities, which is an even more startling statistic, because also we're not being accurately tracked. We'll either be mislabeled as something else, white or Hispanic, Latino. So once we understand, some of these families have been mislabeled, and we're starting to pull these numbers on law enforcement, while also understanding that law enforcement is not even wanting to acknowledge that as a murder. They will do anything they can to justify it, even when they did have to admit they were in the wrong, which has only happened out of one of the cases that we've been tracking.
These two reservations, do they have like tribal police or anything like that on their reservation? They
do. So BIA obviously has a presence there, and then each reservation has their own tribal police. I will say that we have had a really good working relationship with Southern Ute Police Department. We had a missing child in that area that could have been in a number of different states. And a lot of law enforcement agencies, when you start getting this cross-jurisdictional mess, will just like throw their hands up and be like, I don't know, Navajo Nation's supposed to be dealing with it.
Yeah.
And then everyone does the finger pointing and no one actually does action. And they went above and beyond, like communicating with other law enforcement agencies in other states till this child was finally located safely. But they were taking point and actually criticizing other law enforcement departments, like not even action, it was inaction at that point, to try to recover this young person who was at risk while they were missing.
Do the tribal police and the local police, like the state police, do they work okay together, or are they kind of...
We haven't had a ton of interface with like state troopers, for example. That's a bigger project hanging over our heads right now. Where Denver sits specifically is kind of at a crossroads of a north-south corridor, which is I-25, which can take you to New Mexico or Wyoming and beyond. And then we have an east-west corridor, I-70, which takes you out like in through Utah, or east out to Oklahoma. And they're major thoroughfares for literally anybody traveling through the West.
Okay.
And because of that, it's a hub for human trafficking. And it's a hub for drugs and other nefarious things just outside of your usual oblivious tourists trying to get to Yellowstone, or the mountains for skiing, for example. So trying to work with state police and local law enforcement off of I-70 and I-25 when it comes to Indigenous people, because we are, unfortunately, this is a terrible thing to say, highly marketable when it comes to trafficking, because we can pass for a variety of other demographics as they're selling people, essentially.
Well, like you said before, they think we're exotic. I think you're exotic. So, I mean...
That's my favorite, when white men hit on me and tell me I'm so exotic. And I'm like, okay, Chad, with your blue eyes that are not of this continent. Technically, you're the exotic one. Not that I expect you to have any semblance of understanding what words mean. Anyways.
But it seems like the women, the Native American women, are the one, I guess, that's soliciting. I mean, and then go either missing or murdered. So I see that's how the rate goes on that. Because there's a lot of that venture out off the reservation and go into the city. And then from there, I don't know if they go missing or, where they're at the time. Because a lot of relatives from the res are always looking for them.
Yes. And we have had more than one circumstance in which a Native woman was missing. And then when they are found, they were being trafficked. In most of those situations, these women saved themselves. And this is one of the things, and I know it can vary with other jurisdictions, but one of the unfortunate things I've had to communicate and I've had to learn, because life is not Criminal Minds or Law and Order. Typically when you go missing, law enforcement is never looking for you. In Denver specifically, you have a number that you call and you leave a voicemail, and they call you back. Sometimes they'll call you back the same day, but during times when there's like a holiday or it's really busy, I've heard families say that they didn't get a call back within 6 days. There's 2 detectives, for example, that work in DPD's missing persons unit, and all they do is they field phone calls. They'll take some information and then they pass that information to patrol in case patrol comes across you. Outside of that, no one official is looking for you. It doesn't work like that in Denver or Colorado Springs. So part of like where our task force has tried to fill in the gap is we do actually go out and look for people, and try to like solicit leads and figure out where someone might be. And we will partner with the law enforcement agency to feed them information, since let's say they needed to go in and kick down a door or something. They're the only people who can legally do that. But that's kind of how it works. And, that's kind of when I talk about we're accountable to community, we are also accountable to moving our community to find each other. You know, there's a statement out there saying, "I'd look for you." You know, we have elders that come out to help look for missing people, or, you know, they're making sure that people who are out searching, because searching in an urban environment is different than when we've had other cases like in the desert, for example, you know, making sure people have water and sandwiches. We also have, unfortunately, a large unhoused community of natives in Denver. So, you know, knowing that you know, have some food or, you know, hygienic products and stuff on hand for our unhoused relatives. We carry medicines that we can hand out, you know, whether it's a sage bundle or, you know, some tobacco to, you know, help them not become missing later on as well.
Do you think our Native community takes this MMIR seriously, or they should pay more attention to it than they do right now?
I don't know. That's kind of a harder question for me to answer.
Yeah.
I think everyone takes it seriously. And I think that as Native people, we are confronted by just the weight of the world. The weight of colonization is on our shoulders. And I think that when we have moments of respite in which we can find joy, we should take those moments, and that shouldn't be seen as not caring about MMIR or having a flippant attitude towards it.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of the time, like when our people are just, you know, trying to get by, I've seen our community mobilize in massive ways to come together, to either look for a missing person or to support a family who has lost someone to a violent death. And I think that's one of the most beautiful things about our communities is the way we rally in times of adversity. Unfortunately, the adversity seems to happen more for us than it does for other communities. So I would say that I think most people take MMIR seriously. Okay. And their call to action can vary depending on what's happening in their life and what they have capacity for, and that's okay.
I went to a Salt River one they had for MMIP, they call it. And it was really good to see all the community out there. They gave out shirts. We walked the track, and we had a really, you know, they had a lot of stories there. And so I feel like it's really building here in Arizona. I think Colorado's a little ahead of us, but when coming out here with the community, it seems like we're getting there because, it was kind of quiet at first, but when we seen, like, you know, how Colorado's doing their thing and California's doing their thing, I think Arizona's starting to, you know, especially the tribal, when the tribes come together and starts backing things up like this, it really shows the whole Native community that we're all in it together. Agreed.
And I'll shout out Navajo Nation PD. Like, we've had some cases that cross borders because the Four Corners area is right there. And Navajo Nation has always been extremely responsive and receptive to work with in general to try to either locate a missing person or try to solicit a lead to help solve a homicide.
All the time, like most of the time, you know, I follow you on Twitter or X now. You're always at the Capitol, and
oh, no,
yeah, you're always there. You're always you know, in some kind of confrontation. What's the last one you've been in over there at the Capitol? Your confrontation, because you seem like you get that more there, right, than anywhere else.
I think I have made the tweet or whatever we're calling it now, the posting multiple times that the legislature is a violent place for a Native person. And I have cried more times leaving that building than I have not cried when I've left. We were just recently there, the legislature in this past session. Our session ends in May, and then we'll kick up back again in January of 25. They established what they call an American Indian Affairs Interim Study Committee. And essentially, they hear about a variety of issues from different stakeholders and organizations that are Native facing. And they have the ability to draft 3 bills that don't count against each individual's number of bills that they get in the legislature. So we had the third meeting of this interim affairs study committee, and I've pointed it out in testimony on different bills, whether it was MMIR or Indian Child Welfare Act, or we did a bill to prohibit Native mascots. When you're in these buildings, municipal government, whatever, there's all these portraits of just stuffy white dudes.
Yes.
There's like, they have all the presidents in the Colorado State Capitol.
Yes.
And then they have all these other men that are responsible for, trying to eradicate Native people. And I always pointed out, I'm like, we come into this building and we're pleading for like not even bare minimum human rights. And it's confronting policies that all of these, genocidal bastards put into place. Like, if it wasn't for, Andrew Jackson, like, I wouldn't have to be here.
Yeah.
And the intention was that I wouldn't be there. I'm not supposed to be there, not just as a Native person, but as a woman.
Yeah.
What would the founding fathers think? And I'm like, well, they'd probably wonder why a brown woman was talking to them in the first place with such disrespect. So Colorado's legislature, like, we've only had in the 150 some odd year history, we've only had 2 Native reps in that building. We have none currently. We don't have Native lobbying groups. We don't have obviously a Native caucus because we don't have any Native legislators. So there's no representation in that building. So what happens is, we have these quote unquote confrontations because we're going in there and we're talking about really heavy trauma. We're talking about murder. We're talking about boarding schools. We're talking about forcible removal of our children and why it's bad and why we need these other policies to counteract these other policies, on top of the land theft and the cultural assimilation. And because of our country's history of propagandized education, most people don't even can't name a treaty. So you're essentially like also trying to educate these non-Native legislators, and you only get like 3 minutes for your testimony.
Yeah.
Sometimes they let you go a little longer. Some committees are 2 minutes. You're trying to summarize like 500 years of genocide into basically a tweet just to bring these people up to speed on how to talk about the contemporary issue. And within that often comes, they are defensive, they are very casually racist. And almost every single committee, one of those legislators will be like, I have a grandmother who was Native, and it'll be. I've heard Blackfeet. I've heard Cherokee.
Yeah.
And it almost becomes into a means for them to weaponize this ambiguous identity to speak down to us or to try to deny what we're asking for. So without getting into like very specific things, like that is what we confront almost every single time we are in that building.
It's like, my grandma was part of this, so I can say this to you because my grandma was Cherokee, I would say.
Yeah, she was a Cherokee princess. And so now I have the right to tell you that, you asking for law enforcement to identify you accurately is out of pocket. And it's emotional and it takes a toll. And I will emphasize that, like, I'm not the only Native person doing this. Like, we have a really strong community of aunties that show up in the Capitol on the regular. And during this interim affairs study committee, one of the things I really wanted to emphasize with these, group of quote unquote professional lawmakers was that it doesn't need to have Indian or Indigenous or Native American in the title for them to work with our communities. They pass bills all the time that affect healthcare and housing, and they never talk to our organizations or tribes that are, almost disproportionately affected by, housing security or, lack of access to healthcare in like really negative ways. So I'm hoping, because we've had a momentum of Native specific bills in the past like 3 to 4 years, I'm really hoping that the legislature will come around and really start working with our communities like they work with others across the state.
You think the Capitol is getting used to all these aunties coming to the doorstep?
They understand what ribbon skirts are now. But we're about to come up on another election, so you know, we will probably have a lot of new faces next year that don't know.
The last election, your state, was it a blue state or was it a red state? Or I didn't really look. Like, did President Biden win that state?
President Biden won. We're blue technically, but if you were to look at how people vote, we're pretty purple. So everything, I feel Denver, Boulder, and Colorado Springs carry the state with blue. Like where I live in a suburb of Denver, if you drive like 10 minutes outside of me, like there's a literal sign that says this is Trump country.
Okay.
And it's like red, like kind of the unhinged territory. And a lot of Colorado is like that.
And you have that MAGA lady, right, from Colorado that's there.
You know, I was kind of hoping we weren't going to mention Lauren Boebert today.
Yeah.
Little Sarah Palin Jr. She is my electoral district.
Okay.
I have seen her twice in just generally in public. We had a parade. Our county does a fair every year, and they do a parade. So she was like 4 cars ahead of me in the parade and had this giant like livestock trailer with all the Republicans' names on it.
Wow.
Yeah, great times. That woman. Anyways, she's unhinged.
Yeah, I've seen her before. I've seen how she talked, and I'm surprised that she lives in Colorado. But again, I don't know Colorado, so when I hear from you, I can see why she lives in Colorado.
I mean, we have legislators. We have a gun issue every year in the legislature. Like one year, one of the representatives dropped his gun at the well in the House chamber. This past session, another one like left his loaded gun on the shelf in the bathroom. I mean, like we have some things to fix.
Yeah, there's a lot going on over there. But here in Arizona, they always say that the last conference I went to is that the natives out here kind of swung the state, you know, and had Biden win that election. So, because the 4 years before that, Trump won Arizona, but that was an electoral vote again, you know, because here is electoral. So I know some states don't have electoral votes, but here in Arizona we have electoral votes.
Yeah, we swung for Biden. When I first moved to Colorado, though, like 20 years ago, it was 50-50 on whether you would get a Republican or a Democrat. It was pretty heavy Republican, but I feel like those were really different days, and the Republican message was a lot different than what we're looking at now.
Yeah, I heard this one guy say, who was it? He was saying that, you know, a long time ago, the Ku Klux Klan, they wore hoods, but with, you know, the former president, they don't have to hide anymore. They could just come right out, and
they don't hide
say,
at all.
They could say what they want to say because of Trump, you know. And so that kind of thing is stuck in my head, and so, but this election coming up, and we talked this before, is that a lot of Native Americans think like, well, I'm not going to vote because I don't like Harris and I don't like Trump, which I understand. But again, if you're voting in your own state, like you're at the legislative, like I'm over here. Like, I got to look at the district. I got to look at the governor. I got to look at the state senator. I got to, you know, look who's running for council. And like you mentioned before, you brought up to me that even look at the judges because they're the ones that start everything. So I hope, you know, the misconception of this year as president is not. It is, but it's more than that. It's more, you got to look in your own state because like for you, you're always fighting at the Capitol with the people in that state, in that position. You're not fighting with the president. You're fighting with your own Colorado legislative.
And that's where policies start. And it's also the municipal, like I serve on the Denver American Indian Commission, and, you know, we speak with city council. We are a direct line to the mayor's office, for example, and that's where policies and access that really affect your day-to-day start. And so how do I phrase this without going super anarchist? Organizations and people who are influencing politics and policy. And I actually hate the term politics because I feel like it minimizes things. Like we're actually talking about human rights. So when you're talking about politics and not wanting to be involved in that, like I 1000% get it. I just said it's a violent place to be because it wasn't made for us. It was made to get rid of us and work against us. That said, really influential people, organizations, looking at you, Catholic Church, they have these business plans that are hundreds of years into the future. And if we are not consistently in their face or confronting these really harmful policies that leave really terrible legacies for us in particular, they're going to do it. So I think it is in our nature to confront those things to try to make sure that they don't happen. I feel like we're often stuck playing defense and just trying to react to things in real time, as opposed to even understanding like what we're trying to build 7 generations from now, 200 years from now, 300 years from now. What's good for Native people is good for everybody else as well in terms of how we have these societies set up. So I think that if we can really mobilize and start pushing these systems to go that way, without me going on a dismantle everything and start over again speech because we're on a podcast, that's essentially where voting comes into play. With writing your representatives, whether it's the city council, your tribal council, your cousin on tribal council, or writing your state representatives because they think we're invisible. Because oftentimes we are to them until we're in their face. Yeah.
And we're always here. We got the Removal Act. We have all these things against us, but I always tell everybody, well, we're still here. We're still living. We're still here. We still have our culture. We still have our dances and our ceremonies. But we all got to get together on this issue of voting and make sure that we all vote. Especially here in Arizona, we have Kerry Lake and these other people that are pro MAGA. That we don't want them going after certain mining and land and areas like that because they don't care. They just go after they want to dig. We were fighting Oak Flat, for the mining and resolution copper. There's so much copper. I always tell everybody there's so much copper out here, recycled copper, that we don't need that right now. And again, with the water and the 7th generation, we need the water and for our community. And it's just like what you're dealing with the MMIR and like the sacred land and diabetes and cancer for Native Americans. Just there's so many fronts for us to fight, and I feel like MMIR is very important for what's going on up there. I hope we do that down here. Is there anything that you would want to see in the future for your task force? Any more you guys want to do?
I mean, I would like
you ladies want to do.
Yeah. I mean, I would like for us to not need a task force. I very much consider MMIR to be a symptom of all of these other issues that have happened. The lack of education. I've said, extractive resources. We know violence goes up when there are man camps against Native women. Violence against the land equates to violence against our people because we are so connected to the land. That MMIR is just a symptom of all these other issues. It's the heart and the intersection of it. So unfortunately, we have this task force and we're kind of, like I said, reactive. Us working with other leaders in environmental spaces and helping to support them, I think will eventually help address this crisis and make it not a crisis anymore. And then we won't have to have a task force, or we can be the task force of aunties who garden because people aren't, subject to violence anymore. I don't know that I'll see that in my lifetime, but it's a goal.
Yeah. There's a lot of documentaries that are coming out for MMIR, MMIP. Have you seen any of those? Like the recent ones that have come out? Like there's one on HBO about... There's always 3 different scenarios when these things come out. And they're okay, I won't say documentary, they're movies. First is a relative might have done something to this person that's missing. The second one is they're trafficked by, outsider. And the third one is just gone missing, like homeless. Have you seen any of those kind of things on?
I have watched some things. I am very critical of non-natives who produce this kind of content. For one, I often question their motives. Are they doing this in a good way, or are they exploiting and commodifying a movement for whether it's their own portfolio or for money, for example? So, I mean, I've seen Wind River, which was written by Taylor Sheridan, who then went to create Yellowstone, which I have thoughts about. Anyways, but conversely, I think there is power and a need to tell stories, specifically about stolen relatives. So I have also seen movies, documentaries, pieces done by Native creators that are impactful. And I wish that non-natives trying to move in on this space would just lend their power and money and influence to these native creators to even give them a larger platform, as opposed to trying to lead it and do their own thing. Similarly, and I'm a little softer about this, but I will use an anti-tone. All of us on the task force share a similar belief in that we don't believe in commodifying or making money on MMIR. So we are a nonprofit. We do take donations, but we are all volunteers, and we do not get paid to do MMIR work. We don't make a profit. All of our money goes towards whether it's supporting families or travel for families. Or printing flyers for a missing person, for example. I see a lot of merch out there where sometimes it'll say like proceeds are going here, and then I know the person who runs that organization and they never received a donation, for example, for an event or for a t-shirt or whatever. So, within our own communities, I'm always a little softer, but I'm like, do you think it's appropriate to make money on someone else's murder? Someone else's pain? And how are you giving that money back to your community then, if that's how you're turning it?
Well, that's what I was saying before. I think I sent you a flyer a while back. I seen a flyer for MMIP softball tournament, and I thought like, okay, this is for MMIP. It's $150 to play in a tournament. And that's when I started asking, okay, where is the money going? Where is that going to? Is it going somewhere? And they had come back saying it's going to the next tournament to make it bigger. And I thought, that doesn't sound right. Does it mean like if you put that on the flyer, are you going to get more teams? Is that what it means? And I kind of stirred up the pot a little bit, but I think they still went with the tournament. But yeah, I get what you're saying on things like that. And then I know another person who was making MMIP earrings and then got a grant for it. So, and then when I seen her, I was like, oh, where does that money go to? And she didn't want to say anything. And I thought, okay, everyone needs to figure out, like what's going on, why this is important. And if people are donating, where is the money going to? Like for your affiliation, I mean, your task force, if I were to donate to your task force, I know exactly where the money's going.
Correct. Yeah. And so it's interesting you mentioned like earrings and stuff. Like there also is a reality that materials cost money. You have to pay for beads or you got to pay for leather and string and, needles and stuff. Like there is also that reality. And so, again, that's why I use my soft anti voice. When I'm making a kind of a criticism against our own communities with what they're doing with that. At the end of the day, I hope when people engage in MMIR action that they are trying to do things in a good way. Even just sharing social media posts seems so, it's bare minimum, but it can also be really impactful in keeping, that relative's story alive. That is now a living memory when you retweet, a missing person flyer or you retweet asking for information for a homicide. Like that is still keeping that story alive to try to advocate for them later in a good way. If that's all you have, we'll take it. And just like making earrings, MMIP earrings to me is also impactful because it's keeping our campaign, when you're wearing a red dress earring, non-natives will ask you like, what is that? Or now, because it's become a little more mainstream, like I have had several like white individuals in my area say, I know what that means, and I'm so sorry this happens to your community. And sometimes the conversation turns to, how can I help? So I think everyone has, different means in how they're going about spreading awareness for MMIR. So I go back to my soft anti-criticisms because it's not really black and white.
Yeah. Well, that's what I'm saying. For me, I always feel like when I see stuff like that, I'm always asking to myself, where is that money going to go to?
Absolutely.
That's
and
what I'm
I
always,
think we
in
should,
my mind.
I think we should ask that, like, what are you going to do like with that money? And I also recognize the reality sometimes that we got to do what we got to do to keep a roof over our head and keep our children fed.
Yeah.
So I try not to be like super rugged about those criticisms, fully knowing that if I was a homicide victim and somebody sold a red handprint in my name, I'd probably be like, I get it.
Okay. Yeah, I see. I mean, because it's almost the same as like traditional regalia. If you make something, people think, oh, you shouldn't sell it, you should give it away. But again, like you were saying, the leather, the time, your fingers, the needle, everything like that, it takes a lot of work. Because I will see why, you would have to say, well, it's going to be this much money, even though it's something special. Same
well, and
way with
we go back to my, not to be too anarchist on here, but capitalism is very much our reality. And unless we're dismantling that, wink, wink, I don't want to put us on a list.
Yeah.
But unless, we're dismantling the bigger issue of capitalism and colonization, this is kind of the reality that we're sitting in. And it costs money to make things, even if it's to promote a good cause.
Right. And a lot of them, especially like you have a daytime job. I mean, you have another job. I have another job. Like, so the things that I do for my Native community is when I'm not working. And so it takes a lot of time, and so I understand how some are like that and some have to say, okay, it's going to be this much because they took time off of work to do this stuff. But again, that all has to do with the way we're living today. I mean, capitalism
is kind of driving this boat right into, I don't even know what our destination is right now, or if I can even curse. But everyone on the task force has day jobs. Different industries that are not tied to advocacy or even working in law enforcement roles. One of our members, Danielle Seawalker, she works for Michelin Tire Company by day, and she's also an accomplished artist. She's a muralist, and she has an exhibit at History Colorado. She's been shown in Amsterdam. Another of our co-founders, she actually runs the only program in the state specific to Native survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault. Daisy Blue Star, she's Southern U. She runs another nonprofit called Native Love, and she's very involved too in her community down in Ignacio. Lynette Grable, another member of our task force, she runs her own nonprofit as well called Not Our Native Daughters. She serves on other boards. She travels around the country spreading education and awareness, with native and non-native orgs. And, we're all mothers, daughters, friends. Like, we're trying to have fun and go to the powwow and like cut up in the fry bread line. Like,
yeah.
So, like the task force work is like having another job, but it's also things that we were kind of doing anecdotally anyways, because unfortunately, violence permeates our communities so heavily.
It's weird because when you see a lot of people on social media, like your friend, and I have some friends that do a lot of work, they don't know like they have daytime jobs. They do this for a living. No, they don't. Some of my friends actually work at the casino. Like they work, swing shift and day shift, but on social media, you don't see that part. You just see them, out there helping the community, doing what they can for community. And I would say again, working and helping your people, it's not you can't make a living off that.
No, I mean, it doesn't pay well even if you try.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
I mean, even trying to find like grants to fund a nonprofit is, you know, an interesting endeavor. But, you know, like I work for a national contractor. You know, I work building wastewater infrastructure and water infrastructure across the country. And so because of that corporate job and because my hours are pretty standard, like I know what to expect most weeks, it gives me the privilege to have the time, you know, to make sure my bills are paid and, you know, I can feed my daughter and myself and the occasional pair of really bougie earrings because that is a problem for my bank account.
Yeah.
But, you know, because I'm able to be secure in like basic necessities, like feeding my family and keeping a food, you know, a roof over our heads, I then have the capacity to be able to work with MMIR. Because as you said, like you can't make a living off of try to work with your community. So for right now, like I have the privilege to be able to do this.
And what is your next thing coming up for the Capitol? Anything you're going to go to the Capitol for coming up?
Sunday. I don't want to think about that. There will be bill recommendations, or they made bill recommendations coming out of this last interim affairs committee. So there may be some input needed. I don't anticipate having to go testify anymore. We've kind of moved out of that part of the process or present.
Okay.
But in the upcoming session, we actually did get a legislator to commit to sponsoring an MMIR specific license plate. So essentially, when you get your license plate, you would pay $25 for this fancier license plate. We've talked to a couple of artists to kind of pull together a design, and then we'll put it out for community to vote on to see what they like more. More to come with that. But essentially, the proceeds from the license plate would go towards the Office of MMIR, which is the state-run Office of MMIR. And so they actually just hired a new executive director. She's Dana. Her name is Melody Delmar. And she used to do MMIP work in New Mexico prior to her coming to Colorado for this job. So I always say that I'm cautiously optimistic. We'll have to go to the legislature during the session to lobby and advocate for this license plate. I'm hoping that it's not grueling and we have to fight for it. When we started the Office of MMIR, we all, I don't know if it was because we were trying to protect our sanity, but we all thought it would be fairly easy. Like we'd probably need to talk through how things would work and make some concessions there. We never anticipated the opposition that we faced to pass that. So anytime I like go into thinking that something in the legislature might be easy, I'm like, the universe is going to remind me that it is not easy and I'm going to have to fight for a license plate.
It's just, for me, like I was saying before, like politics is just so, like I try to stay away from politics, but it's just a lot. It's just an uphill battle for Native Americans all the time.
I mean, it is when we talk about voting. I mean, let's face it, our candidates, one is the worst, like trademarked. And then the other one, I'm like, you could do so much better. And your track record for Native people is not great. And I get really tired with white women specifically constantly telling me, but it's for the greater good. Because what's for the greater good literally historically has been terrible for our communities. And I'm like, I am tired of taking the sodomy for you to live comfortably over here. Like, I'm done with it. If you can't do what's good for us, then what you're doing is bad.
That's true. When I started the podcast, I was thinking of a name for it, and it took me a while. And I came up with Fight for Our Existence, because there was always like protect sacred land, protect the sacred. There was all
ancestral winds.
Indigenous
for change. See, I just made one up.
So I try to, like, I didn't want like Indigenous or Native American or all these other words for it. And I feel like we're always trying to fight for our existence, like our culture, our ceremony, our women, our men, the ones that are passing, and the land from mining. And it just seems like we're always fighting for our way of life. And this is why I thought, well, this is what the podcast is going to be called, because it falls into MMIR. It falls into land acknowledgement, mining, health and wellness. I've had people on here. I really wanted someone on here for MMIR, and I finally got you out here to talk about that. And so it's just like a whole, like I always say, there's a bunch of fronts, and there's we're all fighting different fronts. And I feel like what you and your task force doing is very important. And I hope you guys make things better for our family and for our community. And do you know, like, what is your goal with this task force?
Well, when you talking about goals, so there's the shorter term goal, which is we're making movement with it now, which was to change the way that law enforcement responds to violence against Native people. It's been a couple of years with some really brutal work with education, with statistics, even just really uncomfortable, hard conversations about these detectives and people who think that they're doing good things and they're actually creating harm. So trying to get them to understand like where the harm is coming from. So we're making some really small movements. I don't want to give cops any more credit than I need to, because again, another podcast for another day.
Yeah, right.
My criticisms of law enforcement or their fecklessness. Anyways, getting them to stop being so harmful to us in every time that we interact with them. That was one of the goals, so that when a Native person goes missing or a Native person has been murdered, they're getting the same treatment that we saw with like Gabby Petito. We saw what should happen when a person goes missing, when a pretty white girl went missing.
Yeah, she was all over the news.
All over the news. These agencies were working together. And her family has said, this is how you should be treating other people who go missing. And I really hate to use her voice in that term, because I don't want to ever make it seem like I'm saying, how dare you treat her like that. They treated her the way we should all be treated when we go missing. While also there's the goal, that's a forward-looking goal in how law enforcement interacts with us. There's also a goal in looking backwards and trying to advocate for justice for our relatives who were murdered, and it's been decades in some of these cases. And, they have grandchildren now. There are parents that are, still don't know what happened to their loved one when they were murdered. Like, they don't know who did it. And these are really brutal, violent crimes. So trying to find some semblance of justice, whether it's at least knowing who did this to their loved one, or if they want to go the full board, like, take them to jail, whatever it is that looks like. That's another goal of mine. We have a significant amount of unsolved homicides sitting on our list, and 64% of them reside within Denver Police Department's jurisdiction. So we've had some preliminary meetings with their cold case unit, and they are currently doing this. We gave them names, and they're doing another, they're pulling those records and doing another review to see if maybe they would solicit some new leads. And I am very confident when I make the assertion that probably all of these cases never received the attention they should have had right out of the gate when these crimes first occurred. So God knows what state these files are in, or what kind of investigation was even done. Those are probably two of the bigger priorities. We're trying to figure out how to mobilize services when we do find a missing person. Oftentimes there's an intersection with other risk factors, untreated mental health, substance abuse disorders, housing instability. So Denver has some Native orgs that provide health services and whatnot, but it's not robust and comprehensive. And so if we, refer someone to a non-Native org, there could be some harm done there just because they don't work with Native people and their cultural competency is abysmal. We actually, through that Interim Affairs Study Committee, they are taking on the bill to make mandatory training of Native education for all licensed healthcare providers in the state. Okay. So that's where a lot of this intersection comes in, where just because we find something, that's not the end. And it doesn't always mean a happy ending in that moment because they need other services that led to them being missing in the first place.
Okay.
So again, like the longer goal is bringing all these other intersectionals issues into a place where they're being addressed, so that if a person does go missing, there is a very clear place to take them to help them later on.
Before we end this episode, is there anything you want to say before about MMIR and?
That's always that's an interesting question. I mean,
for our listeners to know.
Yeah, I mean, for our Native listeners, I mean, again, I don't know anyone who hasn't been touched by this crisis at some capacity or another. We talk a lot about resilience, Natives are strong, resilient, Indigenous. And while I think that's true, and I think that's one of our greatest attributes, I always say that I'm really sorry that we've had to be so resilient. Because what I want, and you talked about goals, what I really want is for our children to live carefree existence and just be secure in the moment without having to confront these awful, terrible legacies and have just the weight of colonization on their shoulders. So I always tell, communities I see you, I hear you, I'm probably thinking of you even if I don't know your name. When we pray and smudge to go out and do this work, it's not just within Colorado. We're thinking about it across the country. We just felt that being hyper-focused on one state was the best way to make an impact in that way. So I see you, and to all those children out there, I'm really sorry. This is the legacy that you might be confronting right now, but I hope we're going to fix that.
Yes, true. And you're also right about this strong and resilient. I mean, that, again, that's a lot of energy. And I don't feel like we should be like that all the time. Yes, we need to chill sometime and enjoy life. But right now,
yeah, sometimes I'm not resilient. Sometimes I'm sad.
Yeah. Oh, Raven, thanks for, getting on the podcast and talking about MMR. And I really appreciate you coming on the show. And hopefully we can do it again.
Yeah, Miigwech for having me.
Oh, you're welcome. All right. Thank you.
Thank you all for tuning into the Fight for Existence podcast. If you guys want to keep up with the podcast in general, what you could do is follow the social media account. The Instagram account is going to be Fight for Our Existence. Again, that's Fight number 4 Our Existence. Go ahead and give that a follow. And if you guys have any questions for us, or you guys would like to be on the podcast, in the Instagram there's a link. Go ahead and click that. No matter what kind of platform you guys listen to this podcast on, there's always that plus or that follow button. So go ahead and click that so you guys can get notifications when we upload our next episode. And if you guys are listening on Spotify, what you can do is go ahead and rate the show. And if you guys are only listening on Apple Podcasts, what you can also do is write a review for the show. Thank you all for tuning into the Fight for Existence podcast, and we will talk to you next time.